The year is 1982. In an isolated Antarctic research station, a group of scientists encounter a shape-shifting alien parasite. After a Norwegian team's helicopter attempts to destroy the creature, the American researchers take in a dog only to discover that it is an alien in disguise. The thing can imitate any organism, leading to paranoia and distrust amongst the crew. As the entity terrorizes them, the men struggle to survive, unsure who is human and who is the monster, in this film that explores themes of isolation, identity, and survival. This week, we dive into our first listener request of the year with John Carpenter's The Thing. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. And this is a great first listener request episode for the year, because I think this is a movie that I probably would not have picked on my own because I like it so much. But one of the things that I also had to recognize in the rewatch is that this is a movie that I feel you had to have kind of come up with. Because if you are a newer visitor to this movie and you are used to what cinema looks like now in terms of special effects and pacing and plot and energy, this might feel a little dated, which is what I hear from people who had never seen it before. But when you go back to when it came out and through the decades since, I really feel it has a selective audience of people that appreciated it early, came up with it, and defend it. How do you feel about it?
This is one of those movies that I, again, wholeheartedly just love. And I love a good secluded thriller, a good secluded horror movie. And when I fall asleep at night, I can always tell the amount of care and strategic planning a secluded horror movie can go through, because I can fall asleep at night to it, because we have the atmosphere, we have the written dialogue that's there, and then you just pop your eyes open just to see the practical effects. This has a little bit of everything that I can just relax and enjoy, but at the same time be at the edge of my feet. This is one of John Carpenter's masterpieces.
Well, I mean, it's my favorite John Carpenter movie, hands down, and I'm a big fan of his movies. Even like his lesser ones, I can consider them guilty pleasures. You know, we talked about Vampires last season, and I think it's goofy fun. It definitely has its faults, but it was one of the films that Gene really defended. Now, this film, I think, had to deal with two major factors that hurt it in its original release. Number one, it came out at the same time as E.T. and got completely trounced by it. Number two, this is 3 years after Ridley Scott's Alien. So anytime you're going to be dealing with a group of people facing an alien presence, and it's going to be R-rated and gory, it's immediately going to be considered an alien clone, which this is most definitely not. But I can see why it was held in that regard for the longest time. I think those two things led it to be a cult classic because it wasn't appreciated as much when it came out. Instead, it was a hit on video, on cable, and in some circles, and kind of in my circle too, it's somewhat preferred to over the Alien franchise. And it's only a solo movie. I mean, it did get a prequel back in 2012 or something. Who cares, honestly? But yeah, I think that's one of the things about this movie is that it had to deal with those two big hindrances: being called an alien clone and being just swallowed up by that monster year that was 1982.
Well, it had to compete with, again, the theme of seclusion. It had to compete with the no one can hear you scream kind of motif. But here's where it really did kind of have to amplify itself, is with the practical effects, with the gore. It had to stand on its own. It had to have a hook. And To me, this is where it really did nail the hook, because when we see these practical effects, we are analyzing the screen. We are grossed out by it, but at the same time, we're asking ourselves, how did they do that? And when we compare it to Aliens, and justifiable, you can compare this to Aliens because it is a seclusion movie, but we're looking at these practical effects on not darkness, because we have the characters like torches, we have flamethrowers lighting up these practical effects. They're not hiding these practical effects. And we're just looking at these aliens, these creatures in awe, because this is what I think really stands out with this movie. It doesn't hide the flaws of practical effects, it really amplifies it. It says, look what I did.
So, we have Rob Bottin to thank for all of the great special effects on this. And that's just one of the pieces. I think special effects get spoken about a lot in this film because they are so impressive, being practical. A lot of body horror before body horror was even really a thing. This is pre-body horror Cronenberg in a sense. But what really gets me is the fact that these characters and the situations and the paranoia of who is human and who is not, that's what the real meat and potatoes is for me in the movie. And that's where I find it more interesting than Alien, where Alien really is a survival story as people get picked off one by one. This does have that theme, except we don't know who the enemy is. So you're adding one more sense of paranoia and persuasion to a story that could be really just considered typical sci-fi. And this is the part that I find really fascinating too, is that the original novella by John Campbell is that. Yet its remake back in the 1950s that Howard Hawks helped do doesn't follow that. It is more of like an alien lurking people through the Antarctica Research Center, and it doesn't really play with the who is real and who is not. So that's the other part too, is that people didn't know that this was a novella adaptation. If they thought it was just a remake of the 1950s movie, it seems very different than that, but that version was watered down, and this is closer to the original. In fact, the novel and the novella are a lot more detailed, where there's multiple things, multiple creatures running around. Where this one, it's really the main creature, and then the rest of the movie is who's got the creature inside them, who is fake and who isn't. And I think that is what really makes it more interesting of a film. Not to mention the great performances by Kurt Russell, by Wilford Brimley, T.K. Carter, who we talked about in our Seems Like Old Times episode. Yeah, that's the other part about this movie, is that the characters are so colorful and memorable. They're not just alien fodder like we would see in other movies like this in the 80s.
Well, this is what I really did appreciate about the thing. When it does pay homage to the 50s creature feature, where you do have kind of like the rubber costumes, you do have the amplified focus on these creatures, and just a generic title like The Thing. This does pay homage to the 50s creature feature, but at the same time, it takes it up a level because it knows the audience has changed. It knows that Alien came out. It knows that this is going to be a almost interpreted as a copycat, where it does actually complement the actual dedication to the 50s. So you do have an amplification of the characters when it comes to how they present their personas. How are they going to present themselves in front of people that they've stayed with in isolation? Do they act differently? Do they have to behave differently? So these are all mysteries of uh, keeping the audience on a hook for how we're going to feel to that. But at the same time, the audience is looking at the characters, but we're anticipating the creature that we're going to see here coming soon. It really is a proper balance between creature feature and almost a character study of an ensemble. And that's what I really did like about the ensemble piece of it, is we don't get this added filler of dialogue. These are really secluded personas. These are secluded personas in a secluded environment that really don't give too much about themselves, because they shouldn't. This is almost a mystery upon itself, of really taking the audience along on, again, like I said earlier, what's going to happen next. And to do that successfully, you have to have the special effects of amazement, but more importantly, the characters of who is going to be next or who is infected with this creature. And the characters are a prominent piece of that because we don't really get anything from these characters at all up until we get to the test results of proving who is the creature. It really does dangle us along in suspense.
I also love the fact that John Carpenter doesn't feel like he has to play in the same sandbox that Alien and Jaws did, where we're going to hide the creature from you. He did the same thing in Halloween. We're going to see Michael Myers the entire time, unlike Friday the 13th, where we keep the killer hidden until the end, right? It's just in the shadows and the POV shots. From this one, you see the creature, at least whatever form of it, pretty much right from the beginning, and we get to see different incarnations of it throughout the movie. He doesn't hide the alien, he doesn't hide the monster. In fact, he uses any opportunity he can to give it a moment of grandstanding with all these great, like, tissue and blown and blood and viscera stretching and spraying all over the place. It's not the same formula that people praised Jaws and Alien for, of like, oh, keep it in the shadows, it'll build the suspense. That is the part of this movie that I love, is that the suspense is not as much built from the monster, the kills, and the scares as it is the distrust and paranoia of the characters from each other. That's where it almost feels like a 50s noir movie of who's the rat, who's the turncoat, who is the person that we can't trust. And he does a lot of that with the shadow work. There's a shot that I always recognize, but really don't take seriously and forget about until now we're having discussion about it. And that is a shot right towards the beginning of the film after they brought the dog into the building, where the dog walks into someone's bunk room and you only see the shadow of the character in the room. And then you see the shadow turn to look at the dog and then it fades to black. That is a 50s noir shot if I've ever seen one. And it's the perfect setup to let us know what this movie is. We don't know who that character is. In fact, that profile of that person doesn't really match any of the characters when we see them in person. That's awesome because it's messing with our minds and our perception of who is this guy. This guy doesn't have the hair, the glasses, the beard of anyone that are in the main cast. And it's a good way to throw us off the scent and let us know what kind of movie we're in for. That's where John Carpenter was playing with an entirely different toolbox than other horror filmmakers, is that he knew to pull from mystery movies, murder movies, and noir movies to make his canvas of this body horror alien creature feature even more intense and more suspenseful.
Well, you mentioned the dog, but the shadows, you're absolutely right. The shadows are spot on. But the music score to this,
Yes.
when it comes to the dog tiptoeing through each room, you can almost hear the 50s violin just kind of tiptoeing along with the dog, but it's just not present. So there are nods to this that doesn't go all in on the creature feature. It allows these animals, it allows these characters to kind of just take us along using the lighting, because this hands down does have brilliant lighting to it from start to finish. But when it comes to the score of it, that did win a Razzie during time of release with Morricone, that we'll probably get into because I know you're grinning at it. I know what we're going to get into. But this is one that does have that Jaws feel to it, where it's so simplistic with the timpanis just moving these characters along. It's simplistic and it's brilliant, and it adds edge to these characters, and again plays homage to the 50 movies that we see, only on a base level. We don't get the high tones, we get the bases, we get the danger feeling of it to really complement the atmosphere in a simplistic level. So this is where it takes those 50s creatures features and amplifies it to a current audience. And that's what really does take this movie to a next suspenseful level.
I'm glad that you said that, because those kind of lo-fi distorted bass notes throughout the movie, they play with the characters' movements. Like you said, the dog walking through the hallway, or, for example, McCready drinking scotch, reading a book, talking into his little dictaphone. It's all set to an ominous tone where it almost creates the atmosphere as well. Yeah, this movie plays on so many different levels, and I think the things that I've read, the stuff that I've watched on the Blu-ray, and the critics' reviews that we're going to be going to in a minute, that this stuff just wasn't absorbed and appreciated at first, because I honestly think that people had a hard time figuring out what this movie was. And that's why it gained appreciation and popularity over time, because people had a chance to absorb it more on VHS and on cable. I mean, growing up, dude, this was on TNT all the time. It was the TV version, but it didn't take away from the fact that it was a suspenseful movie with lots of delicate plot points and twists and character developments that had to be reassessed watch over watch to understand who was who, what was what. And at the end of the day, it's still ambiguous, right?
100%. And I think what the miss was at this time is that they have so many characters here, and they pick and choose what characters are going to get the screen time or their appropriate screen time. We have some great cast members here, and nobody has 100% equal amount of screen time because we're bouncing off to where we need to have the mystery, where we have to have the suspense. And that's where this movie really does stand as its own, where it doesn't really care about that. It cares about building suspense. It cares about not having necessarily, as our critics will speak to it, throwaway characters. They are throwaway characters because they all are on defense. They have to have a defense up. And I think that was the biggest miss, because we have that comparison to the creature features, to the evolution, to aliens. So everybody going into this movie is going to see the aliens idea just 3 years prior. And that's going to be a hard thing for a movie to go up against. And I think the filmmakers were smart here with the visual effects. But at the same time, I think where they missed, not now, but back then, is with how audiences were going to react to how we get invested into the characters. And I think this is where it's going to really separate it from the Alien comparison, because we do have a memorable Sigourney Weaver character. Here, Kurt Russell does a fantastic job, but the dialogue doesn't give him enough because the story doesn't demand it.
Mm.
This story is not meant for what we got from Aliens. And I think that's what audiences and critics back then really did miss.
Well, because that's the thing, is if you give this movie a real hero, then it kind of dissolves the idea of who's infected and who's not. Like, you kind of have to have a level playing field so the stakes remain the same. And when we think about Kurt Russell and John Carpenter movies, he is an exuberant character. Big Trouble in Little China, Snake Plissken, these are memorable characters who essentially are there to steal the show. The level of restraint in both Kurt Russell's performance and John Carpenter's direction of him and Keith David, those are, I think, the tones that make this movie work the best, because at any one moment, any of these characters could potentially be the lead. And as they are discovered to be a creature, or killed, or murdered for being mistaken as a creature and not be, that just adds to the stakes even more. It would not be surprising to me if there was a draft of this where McCready was taken out in the middle, And I think, and this is just me tinfoil hatting it, I always thought that Hateful Eight was like Tarantino's Western version of The Thing, right? You put them all in one room. Who's the bad guy? Who's the traitor? Who's got the ulterior motive? And to have Kurt Russell check out midway of that one is kind of like his little wink and nudge saying, okay, well, he's not McCready in this. He's not lasting till the end. In fact, he's going to be the first one that goes. I've always liked that little playfulness between that movie and this movie.
I love the playfulness between the who's going to be next, the mystery element to it. And I love, it's funny that you mentioned the Hateful Eight, because Morricone actually had the Thing score built into
He
this
did.
that he won an Oscar for versus a Razzie in 82. So I think that's funny. But I think it just goes to show how characters and music really do move a story along. And I think in both examples, it's more forte in the Hateful Eight, but at the same time, it's appropriately used in The Thing, because we can't have a lot of music going into The Thing other than just kind of the sound bites that we hear to really move these characters along. This movie is at its best when it's silenced, because that complements the atmosphere and the mystery. We are left with our own thoughts without any almost anticipation. We are having these characters silent to find out who is going to be the next suspect or who's going to accuse who. The most tenseful moments of this movie is really the accusation piece of it. And we get that in almost a Hateful Eight as well.
So I think one of the things I can say about this movie is I almost feel like it is the tape from The Ring. Like this is a movie that's been passed on to people and shared, and then that gets passed on to someone else, and then that gets passed on to someone else. Because at face value, we already discussed this. It wasn't popular, it wasn't a hit, it got swallowed up. But also, there is something very important about this movie in the sense that it begs for a rewatch, and this is a time where we did not really want ambiguity in our movies. It was almost a movie that begged to be discussed in the lobby of the theater on your way out or on the car ride home. Is Kurt Russell the thing or is he not? Is Keith David the thing or is he not? And the fact they're just going to sit there and potentially freeze to death until someone comes along and finds their bodies and ends up taking one of them back to civilization for the thing to complete its task. That is just marvelous storytelling. It doesn't need a sequel because we're going to create our own sequels in our mind. It's very hard for me to think of a film right off the top of my head that leaves that kind of open-ended ambiguity after such a climactic ending and closing on that book, just kind of tied up into a nice little package. It really is one of the most perfect horror, suspense, sci-fi movies because it's genre bending ever made.
100%. And as we get into the climax, this is where I think audiences were frustrated is that we're not spoon fed the answer, even though Kurt Russell ended up being the thing. And I'll just keep that to
Mhm.
my opinion. But this is where audiences really didn't, I think, in my opinion, weren't ready to have no ending, real no climax to it. They are challenged to think for themselves in suspense. And you're right. This is a movie that is open for discussion, leaving the lobby, in the car, at the home, whatever it may be. And those are the best kinds of movies because you can argue up and down for hours and never have a right answer. And this is a 2 hour movie that can end in 4 hours of entertainment of just pure dialogue, fun banter, and speculation. And this is why this is John Carpenter's best because it leaves it open ended for that conversation that we don't really get from thrillers or horror movies per se, especially in 82, where everything is so structured and so straightforward when it comes to formula. This one went off formula and nobody was ready for it.
And also, it is hard for people to decide what kind of movie this is because it's not a slasher and it's not a full on creature movie. It does bend a lot of genres. And I think that might be why one of our critics didn't like it. And the critic that defends it didn't necessarily like it either. They just favored it more on the edge of, I appreciate what this movie was doing. And I think there's a lot of great storytelling and character development. But once again, one of the things that both of them kind of turned their noses up at, especially at this time of the 80s, was the effects, the violence, and the gore. So Gene brought this film to the show.
About 2 weeks ago, something very unusual happened to me. I began getting postcards at my newspaper office from readers telling me that John Carpenter's new movie, I guess they'd seen it in a preview, was one of the most disgusting films ever made. Well, those postcard writers certainly were right about one thing. The movie The Thing does contain a lot of repellent special effects, telling the story of a creature that is discovered in the Antarctic by a team of American scientists. Later, there's a terrific blood test where they try and check out who is human, who is not. I wish this movie were less ugly than it is, because in terms of storytelling and suspense, and that subtext of suspicion of one's fellow man, this is actually a very well-made movie. But at regular intervals, no doubt about it, it does gross one out. So, a mixed review for The Thing from me. I'm going to recommend it, but serve notice that a lot of people who see it will be made sick by it.
I mean, this is before the time of, just complete gross out horror and violence and gore in films. We were just barely starting to see that in the slasher genre, which they both hated it. So being able to defend the film for its storytelling, he's on the right path. Because like we both agree, that is what this movie really is about. It is not about an exercise of gore and violence. It is an exercise in suspense and terror. It's very Rod Serling, like if you think about the Twilight Zone episodes that he wrote and Night Gallery, there were levels of ambiguity into his stories and endings that he was famous for, that M. Night Shyamalan and Jordan Peele have to give credit to, because without the way he developed audiences' senses of not being able to trust the narrative and being surprised at the end of, hey, this has a completely different meaning than what the 45, 50 minutes of narrative before it gave me, he has to owe it to that kind of writing. This feels like something that Rod Serling would have written. He wouldn't have given it an ending set in stone. He would have left it ambiguous. Figure it out for yourself. Watch it again. Dissect it even more. That challenges Gene, and Gene does like being challenged with plot like that. But of course, we have to listen to him talk about his least favorite thing of this era, and that is the ugliness of a movie. The disgusting special effects, the ugliness of the visuals, which are appreciated now for their practicality and their originality and their creativity. But at this point in time, it feels like none of that mattered. The appreciation of film craft involved in this movie is, instead of being championed and cherished, it's kind of being disavowed because it's gross.
I just want names of the people that actually sent postcards to this man instead of just letters, spending the money on a postcard to complain about this movie. But here's the thing. Gene's not too far off, but he's right, but he's wrong, because we take the key word here, repellent, of turning people off to this movie. But this is what this movie really has the appeal of. And again, it's the time, whatever it may be. At the time, I get it. But we have, even to his words, a well-made movie. And there should be no debate. This is a well-made movie, from, like you spoke to, the shadows, the torches, the red lighting, the music in the background that wasn't appreciated at the time. So this is hands down a well-made movie. But to just focus on the disgustingness of it, when you're set in this isolated area, you have to have something to slap you across the face and say, wake up. Because if we had just a creature in a rubber suit running around this isolated area, it wouldn't have had the same conflict. It wouldn't have had the same danger. It wouldn't still have the same thrills. So we need to have an amplified, disgusting shock factor to really wake the audience up to say, these are the high stakes here. So this is where I spoke to earlier, where it's a proper balance. And Gene can't get over the aspect that is just gross. It's okay to be gross in a movie as long as it makes it relevant. And here it makes it relevant because it's an added conflict. So Gene, like I said, right but wrong. But I think if you would have taken the disgusting piece out of it, he wouldn't have appreciated it as much as he did, because he doesn't realize at this point in the review, after a rewatch, that it's actually needed for a movie like this.
I think the two things that I could say about what he's feeling in his pros and cons of this review is, for the pros, he talks about it a little bit. This is still a time in the early 80s where that generation had to live through a lot of not in my backyardisms, right? And who is red, who's a commie, and who's a spy. There was a lot of suspicion about people's neighbors. Again, I'll go back to Serling. His Twilight Zone episodes are perfect reflections of that, of being able to look at whatever was going on socially and politically and then turn it into a science fiction story that made it easy for the audiences of America to understand and possibly reflect on themselves, like, oh, maybe I am just being over paranoid because of what I see on TV or hear on the radio or whatever a politician says. And we still do that to this day. So being able to play that as the storyline, I think, is what he's really appreciating. And he brings it up again in a minute. And then when it goes to like the grossness, my point to this is, one of the things about Alien and one of the things about Jaws that I think people could really attach them to with those films is that they had no questions of what their enemy was. It was tangible. You saw it in its fully developed form. You knew exactly what it was. You knew exactly what to be afraid of. A giant shark, a biomechanical xenomorph. We knew what it was. What's brilliant about this movie is we never see the creature in a fulfilled state. We have no idea what it really looks like. Does it even have a final state? Or is it just always a constant mass of developing cells that are trying to imitate another life form? It maybe not doesn't even have a fully realized version of itself. To me, that is more frightening because you never know what to be afraid of. You're afraid of biology. And that's what's really cool about this. And I just don't think that certain audiences or critics at this time were ready to let go of the idea that we needed a personified villain, creature, monster, whatever you want to call it. The fact that this was something that was completely displaced is one of the reasons why I think he didn't like it as much, because he couldn't attach it to something visible.
Well, we look at that and we look at the overall messaging of, I think that was missed among a lot of critics, is survival of the fittest.
Mhm.
Because we have a creature here that wants to survive. We have mankind that wants to survive. And we see that underlying theme that's usually missed in a lot of these alien movies. That's just conquer, conquer, conquer. So we can easily look at this movie as a conquer movie, but at the same time, we have this creature that's buried in ice that's discovered. We don't know how it got here. We just know that it's harvesting or taking over human form for survival. So ultimately, these are a creature that almost challenges the audience to say, do we sympathize for this character that he's trying to survive, or are we sympathizing with these characters that are trying to survive? So that is one of the big question marks on this movie that really does go missed, even though we look at these grotesque images that we see. But I think that's the underlying point here, is that we fear what we don't understand. And I think that's the brilliance to Carpenter here, is showing that vision. And to me, with our two critics, I think that was a heavy miss of why they can't see that. We're just seeing that creature. We're just seeing that mass creature just take over and kill. But we're seeing the word kill, but we're not seeing the survival piece of it. And I think there's a deeper message to the thing, as dare as I may say. And I think that's where I don't think they look at this movie, or they're taking it serious enough to really look at that aspect of it.
I think that's probably an understatement. I would call this the barf bag movie of July. I have some problems with it. One of them is, I think, the characters. They're not made into three-dimensional people. Their function is to walk down the corridor and be jumped on. The other thing is plausibility. Once they figure out that this thing can turn into one of them, they ought to institute a watertight buddy system, but instead they have all kinds of loopholes. People walk out into the snow, come back with a grin on their face, so that the story is totally implausible, and the movie just basically is an excuse for this very gruesome and repellent creature to gross us out. It is the most nauseating thing I've ever seen on a movie screen.
So this is where I disagree with him 100%. Like, those characters are given nuance right away, instantly, as they are brought into frame. But it's also very strongly built up that no one really has a camaraderie with one another. Like, everyone has their own individuality. For example, Windows wants to listen to his radio, and McCready wants to drink scotch and play computer chess, and Wilfred Brimley wants to do his research. Like, everyone is there with their own personal agenda, which makes it plausible, in my opinion, why they are paranoid from each other, because no one really has any real connections to each other. His statement doesn't really work for me. I feel like it is a reach just to get to the point that he doesn't like the barf bag visuals of the movie and the plausibility. I think he's wrong. The plausibility is totally there. If they were like military guys that were brothers in arms, it would be a different story. But this isn't that. These are guys that, in my opinion, were literally trying to escape society. And that's why they are in the ass end of Antarctica doing whatever it is they're doing out there. That's how it feels to me, and that builds the plausibility. And I'd want to say, well, what do I know? I'm not a movie critic, but I've seen enough films and I know enough about plot development and character structure to know that he's wrong.
So this, I agree with you 100%. Well, 99%. Here's where I think we steer off a little bit, is even during my first watch on this, it does feel like a pretty straightforward movie. But this is one of those rare horror movies that you can't judge it with a first watch.
Agreed.
And we've had this discussion
Agreed.
before.
Mhm.
at a surface level during the first watch, I can see Roger's point of view, but that doesn't really make this. Again, I would love to see a review later down the road where he can actually dive in and take his time with this, because I can see the intent of what he's visually seeing of these bland throwaway characters. But you're right, because we're in isolation here and you can take it two different ways. One, they can be distant because they want to escape society, they want to be by themselves, they want to be in the quiet. Or two, they are in this small area together and they have to know each other and they have to get to know each other. And I think the movie escapes that a little bit of giving us some context of what area we're kind of looking at these characters. So if I had to give a critique of the movie, I'd say Roger's somewhat right that we could have had a little bit context of what these characters' sub origins were, of how they interact with each other, and take 5 minutes to that. But at the same time, we develop our own interpretation, just like this whole movie, that as they interact with each other, as we learn that they are distant characters, or all these manly men characters that are very whole standoffish with each other and with their own personas. So we learn it as we go along, but to some critics, I can see where they can misinterpret how to take where the character development really goes with this group, or this ensemble, I should say. So this isn't the movie that Roger wanted. He wanted some more context in the beginning of it to justify the actions. But at the same time, we learn the actions as we go along and we create the direction that these characters go to.
Quite a statement.
I think I'll stand behind
Yeah,
it.
I think that the movie for me, though, isn't about those characters as individual people. I think that's why they can be interchangeable. I think that it's about how a society, this little group here, wants to poison. They think something's going wrong. You're not in the group. You're out. Move. Just that line. Move away to one side. It's a very chilling thing. And I think if you read the movie in that way, then the implausibilities at your level mean very little. And so you sit there wishing, and I do wish, that it were a lot cleaner.
So I really, really agree with what he's saying, where if you can just look past the visuals, if that is what disturbs you, and he says he wants to be it cleaner, that's fine. But he gets it. He gets what Carpenter was trying to do, and he gets what these performers were trying to do. And that is that no one trusted each other before the thing showed up, which only increased the amount of distrust and paranoia after the thing showed up. You could have made this film with no special effects. You could have made this film with no alien on screen, and it still would have worked, because the movie's all about the subtext, which is exactly his point. So I have to agree with him on that part of his review.
I agree. I think he is hinting at what or how this movie should be interpreted, and I think Roger's just not going to buy into it. So there is a lot of points that I was surprised with Gene, on looking past the grotesqueness of it. And I think out of both critics, he's the one that would have gone all in on hating this movie, on the ugliness of not the movie, but the creatures. So I think I am pleasantly surprised with how Gene is really going to the defense of this movie, because I don't remember this review in Gene's defense. I remember Rogers, and it took me by surprise a little bit.
Me too. I mean, do you think that Roger's being contradictory just to be contradictory, just for good TV? Or do you really think that he just found this movie unpleasant?
I think he found it unpleasant, and kind of knowing Roger's past, we take a lot of sci-fi, and you can put that into one of the subgenres here. He wants some substance to it. He wants the explanation. He not necessarily wants to have a thought-provoking feeling leaving the theater, but he also wants a reason why he should feel he needs to think about the movie, and he can't get past the grotesqueness of it. He can't get past the creature of it. He wants more of the challenge piece of it, and that's more with the characters. And that's not what this movie is. So, and he's having trouble getting past that. So I think with him, he wanted a lot more, especially given John Carpenter and Halloween, and just the anticipation of what he's getting. So, but that's not this movie. This movie, as we're actually talking about the last topic, it's almost more we can actually discuss for another hour of what this movie actually means. So I think this is being very thought-provoking without Roger knowing it's supposed to be thought-provoking.
I mean, it was essentially a year ago in one of our first episodes that we did Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which has very similar themes. And both of them are very complimentary of that movie, Roger especially. And I feel like that represents what he liked in that story, in the paranoia of it, and being able to deal with an alien species that replicates and invades. But the difference between the two is that one doesn't rely on special effects as much as this one does. And this one is trying to do both. It's trying to give you a visceral experience, it's trying to give you a philosophical and sociological experience with its storytelling. And he wants the one and not the other.
I think, Gene, though, that I've got news for you, and that is that 99% of the people who go to see this movie are there to see the monsters, and very few of them are going to read it as your kind of allegory of McCarthyism.
And we split on the thing. Roger, as you can remember, was appalled by the monsters in the film. He calls it a geek show. I didn't enjoy looking at the monsters either, but I did find it to be an interesting element in the movie, the element of suspicion of something rotten in one's fellow man.
So I think that is a totally subjective opinion from Roger, where he is now saying that, you know, the audience isn't going to be looking for subtext in their horror movie. That's where I disagree, because I feel like horror films, well-made horror films, deliver political and sociological subtext better than some dramas do, because they have found a vessel. They have found almost like a carrier oil to deliver their message through in means of entertainment and scares and suspense and paranoia, and not just dialogue, not just people talking, not talking heads on a screen for an hour and a half that tell a story through words and not through actions. That's why I agree with Gene, is that what better way to deliver a socio-political message and subtext in a movie than delivering it in a movie that's going to give you scares and jumps and visceral reactions to what you're seeing on screen. It's like scaring someone who has the hiccups and getting them to change their mindset of having the hiccups. That's what this is. It's giving you horror, suspense, and just thrills through visual mediums to deliver a message of what you could say McCarthyism. I'm just going to say flat out 50s to 90s sociological paranoia about your fellow man. Like, that's what it is, in my opinion. And it's not black and white. It's muddled, but that's what makes it entertaining. Because if it was black and white, then you're just feeling you're being preached to.
Here's my biggest disagreement with Roger is the comment that people are going to go see this for the monster. Wrong. Wrong. With me especially, if I'm going to a movie, let's say Jaws, the water's a scary piece of it. When we see alien, space is the scariest piece of it. When we see this being alone miles and miles away in the freezing cold, that's the scariest piece of it. The setting is the scary piece of it. And then you have the conflict, which is the monster. But we're scared and we're nervous before we even get to that point, which shows that the setting of isolation, the fear of being helpless, is going to be the fear, not the monster. Because even when the monster is on screen, when we take all of those movies, yeah, you'll have the element of jump scares, you'll have that moment of suspense, but the real terrifying moment is what leads up to that, in the water, in space, in isolation, whatever it may be. So people aren't going just to see a glimpse of a monster. They're going to be thrilled. They're going to be scared. And we get that well before the monster is even present on screen. That's where I think this, with Roger as a movie critic, should realize this, is you get the shock factor, but the fear element is always present, opposite of the monster.
So when it comes to giving a review and giving a grade on my critic, on Gene, you know, the fact that he defended this movie, that's always going to be big on my side when he actually defends a movie that Roger hates. And it's not even necessarily that he dislikes the movie. He sees and he recognizes the good in it, reluctantly saying, hey, I recommend this if you can handle the scare, if you can handle the grotesque visuals that it has. But that's okay. we talked about it in the Naked Lunch episode last week, where it's like they were both fascinated by the accomplishment that Cronenberg gave us with that film. But at the same time, they were both disgusted and made uneasy by the visuals. And they actually didn't even like what the movie was doing, but they couldn't not say that it was well made. It's very similar in that aspect. I think he is praising the storytelling, the performances, and the direction more than he is the special effects, which now it's kind of what is mostly talked about with this movie in hindsight, is how much they did before computer generated imagery. So yeah, with that, I'm going to have to say that I'm going to give him a reluctant B.
And I think that's fair. And Roger, I'm going to give a little bit of leniency on, but not a lot. Because again, this is a rewatch type of movie to really grasp what the filmmakers are trying to do. At first reaction, you're not going to get the full intake of what this movie is. But here's kind of my disappointment with him is at this point, he has had movie review after movie review, especially with horror, and he misses all the elements of how the movie looks outside of the monsters. He can't get past that. The lighting is good, as we discussed. The setting is properly done, even though I would have loved to see more of the environment pulled out a little bit. And the performances are just where they need to be. So all the elements leading into the suspense, he misses, and he just can't get over how ugly the movie is, in his words, but it's the creature that he doesn't like. And you can't judge a movie just based on the disgusting creature that the movie has as its antagonist. It really does have to go past that on all the other elements that do work, and he doesn't advertise that. So just because this movie is a challenging one, even for him to acknowledge during a first time watch, I'll give him a half a star leniency, but I'm going to give him 1.5 stars on this one.
I mean, once again, it's like we don't get a full review from him. We just get an opinion of what kind of film it is and how it made him feel. And that's fine. It's TV. I did not read his written review of this film, so I have no context of what he said in essay form. But just the way he presented it, yeah, I agree with you. It's not his best. And normally, he is the voice of reason in films like this. If it is an ugly film, if it does disturb him, he usually does add more to the actual filmmaking or performances or writing or even music. But in this case, he doesn't do that. He talks about plausibility and grossness. It's two things that I think that if that's what you're looking for in any film, you've already lost the battle. If you're trying to look for plausibility in an imaginary story on screen, I'm sorry.
100%. So, I mean, with this one, I'm actually proud of Gene, and I don't say that often, but he actually did bring his A game to the defense on this one. Well deserved.
Yeah, he's been having a pretty good 2025 so far in the films that we've covered. It's like, wow, he's surprised me more often than last season. So maybe we can keep that up. All right, well, that was a great conversation. So next week, we are bringing another listener request, this time from one of my cult-worthy fans in my Instagram stories. My friend John recommended Ernest Goes to Camp, which I'm excited for because I've had that DVD on my shelf for 20 years and I have not popped it in once. So this will be a good opportunity to revisit it and revisit the review of Gene and Roger. How do you feel about this one?
I can't wait for this one. I knew it was coming, and we actually popped it in on New Year's Eve for the whole family to watch, and I cannot wait for this conversation. So It's going to be a fun one.
I mean, it's funny because I watch Ernest Scared Stupid pretty much every year, but for some reason, Ernest Goes to Camp, I have fond memories of it, but it is kind of, in the filing cabinet of my mind space. So it's time to see what it really is like in my modern time. So yeah, excited for that. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for listening, for watching. We are going to do a couple more of these listener suggestion episodes before we start jumping into our, let's call them enigma reviews, films that we really aren't familiar with, but we know that Roger and Gene had them on their show. And so we're going through that list of discovery episodes for us before we probably jump into some more familiar movies down the line. But we want to get some of these episodes out of the way so we can have fresh perspectives on these critiques. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. You can find me, Antonio, over at thecultworthy.com. Got a lot of great stuff coming up on my show, and I got a shout out right now that my third show, which has been on hiatus, the MILF and Me podcast, is coming back more than likely late January, early February. So if you're a fan of that show, stay tuned for that. You can find all my stuff at thecultworthy.com. My friend Justin Henson, you can find over at
themoviewire.com.
Thank you for watching, listening. Give us 5 stars, rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. And Justin, I'll see you next week.
See you next week.